right. Well, let's kick it off with the Bundesliga stuff. Friday, the derby between the two Borussias. And people always ask, and if you haven't heard me say that before, Borussia is just the Latin name for Prussians. So if you wonder what the name Borussia actually means and why there is so many Borussias in that part of Germany is because, it was part of the Prussian Empire before Germany became one country. And Borussia is just the name for Prussia in Latin. So there you have it. So if your club is named Borussia Dortmund, you're essentially just a Bayern Munich from a different part of the country. So this is the derby of the big Borussias. There's, of course, lots of other Borussias as well, dotted all over that part of Germany. And, of course, Preußen Münster as well, which just took the German name. But this derby, it ended 2-0 for Borussia Dortmund, a late Maxi Beier goal. But it was, a lot closer than I think Borussia Dortmund wanted it to be, and it really speaks for the work that Eugen Polanski has been doing at Gladbach, getting them out of the basement of the table. They're now comfortable mid-table, I think, which is what they would have totally taken a few weeks ago. But it also, Dortmund comfortably in second place, 9-point gap to Bayern Munich. And there's been so much talk about the dressing room with Schlotterbeck and Kovac and now Adeyemi in the bust up, where he wanted to go straight to the dressing room when he was brought off in the 60th minute. And I think we can talk about the Adeyemi stuff in a moment. And I think we also have to highlight that the results-wise, this isn't as terrible as it maybe feels for Dortmund fans. Bayern Munich have been playing a fantastic first 15 games of the season, and we get to talk about them in a moment too. But despite all of that, despite the good results in the Champions League, despite the fact that in the Bundesliga, there's a few results that they probably want to have back, it's not actually that bad. It feels like a crisis at the moment.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because we'll come on to talk about Leverkusen and Leipzig later in the show, and I think the comparisons between them and Dortmund's really interesting right now. And I've actually wrote my newsletter this week on Leverkusen. I won't give it away, but I do draw a lot of comparisons to Dortmund in it. And I think if you're a Dortmund fan, you could probably look at that league table, take a deep breath and just think, I'm going to go enjoy my Christmas. I'm going to stop thinking about football for a couple of weeks and we'll see what happens in January, because it feels like they've kind of limped over the line here, doesn't it? They've got over the finish line, sprained their ankle, they've dislocated their knee, I don't know, they've done something, they're really struggling at the end of the finish line, but they got there in the end to an extent. And even this game alone, I know Gladbach were, I thought, quite solid. They looked far better than they have done, obviously, at the start of the season because they were quite competitive. Dortmund obviously had plenty of chances to score. Guirassy had a goal ruled offside. Maximilian Beier missed a one-on-one, which he seems to be doing at least once a week at this moment in time, which is a concern for me. For the most part, and there's also half chances, Adeyemi intercepted one kind of pass across the goal and it almost went in and things like that. So, it was a lively and spirited performance from Dortmund, but I do think it kind of maybe showcased a team that were a little tired, a little jaded, maybe a side that have had to deal with a lot of criticism in and outside the club, perhaps, or outside the stadium, if you will. There's a lot of noise around a lot of the players right now. Niko Kovac is dealing with some pressure as well on his job. And not to mention the kind of wider, how do I put it, the kind of, I guess, I don't want to keep using the word criticism, but I guess wider kind of criticism of the board itself. And, we've obviously talked about that around the AGM time and how Watzke perhaps isn't the undisputed voice of leadership and reason that he once was at Dortmund. And I do think they'll probably have to look at the January transfer window, or at least they should look at the January transfer window and probably think the two teams that are breathing down our neck in Leipzig and Leverkusen have a lot more strength and depth in a lot of areas. Leipzig don't have the Champions League to contend with. And, Leverkusen are certainly in the ascendancy since Hjulman came in. So, I think this result itself was a solid one, but again, also one you would expect them to win. It's at home where they are usually typically solid. They've got a pretty decent record against Gladbach. In fact, it's a very good record if I'm not mistaken. And, for all of Gladbach's improvements in recent weeks, they're still a team that are mid-table at best. They've still got decent players in there. I thought Gio Reyna looked quite good at times. Rocco Reitz looked decent at times. But I think it was just getting over the line. That's all that really mattered to you. Getting the 3 points, get to the winter break. and we'll kind of just, make base camp here and try and regather our thoughts and our emotions and our energy, and then tackle the second half of the season when it comes, really.
Yeah, I mean, emotions is probably the good point to move on to Adeyemi, yeah?
Should we explain what happened for people who maybe didn't see what happened?
Yeah, we should. I mean, it's the 60th minute. He comes off for Maxi Beier, right? And throws a temper tantrum on the bench, and essentially wants to walk off to the dressing room. Bastian Kehl, his role is the sporting director at the moment, right?
His role there was like a linebacker. He basically intercepted him, kind of pinned him down.
He's basically, made it clear to Karim Adeyemi in no small terms that he is not going to go off to the dressing room and do his own thing. And then, of course, the club came out afterwards very strongly and said that Adeyemi would receive a fine, that he's going to be reminded of the values of the club. I haven't 100% checked what the fine was, but this, I think this is just another escalation of the things that are happening between Borussia Dortmund and Adeyemi, and also Adeyemi, of course, whose personal life is very public because he's together with Loredana Safi, an Albanian Swiss rapper, right? She's born from the Kosovo. She's quite a bit older than him. They've been married since 2024. I think she played a really big role in the fact that the whole scandal where weapons were found in his possessions. And they were fined 60 daily payments of 7,500 euros. And to remind people too, in Germany, fines are often based on how much money you make, so they can be quite high. And I think because of that, he gives himself a platform to be attacked by the public. Bild wrote a very nasty article that I think borders on racism. Today, I believe it came out. We're using the kind of rapper language to make Adeyemi look like someone he's not, I think. But I think on the other side of that is that he is a player who we all know has an enormous amount of talent. We all feel like a lot of the talent is being wasted or not always being put forward. Kovac is very hard on him, I think, which is something that he is struggling with. I think part of the reason why Adeyemi was brought off after 60 minutes is because he didn't play to the level that Kovac requires of him, or puts in the shift or the work shift that Kovac requires of him. And Kovac isn't exactly someone who's not familiar with the world that Adeyemi lives in. He himself is born and raised in Berlin. He grew up in a circle that is very similar to the sort of circle that Adeyemi lives in. The players crossing with popular culture, music kind of thing. So it's not like Kovac doesn't understand that aspect, right? And it's probably also why he's so harsh on Adeyemi. But I feel like we're getting into a stage now where the escalation between the two sides. And remember, I think it was last summer where he almost went off to Napoli. And it's getting to the point now where you almost wonder, is Adeyemi maybe off this January? We put out a social media post on Transfermarkt today where you saw players that were out of contract as of June 2027, right, Stefan? And he was on it together with Schlotterbeck, who's also been critical. So I think, that is the one, the Adeyemi one is the one that is so very public and is starting to become a public conflict that because of his background and where he's from, I think offers a bigger platform for especially tabloid papers, which is, I personally think is not fair. But it's the world that we unfortunately live in. But, at the same time, it also highlights that not everything is well between the players, the coaches, the club. There's no harmony at the moment. And that can be sometimes a good thing too. You look at Bayern Munich. This is a club that uses conflict or has used conflict in the past to get the best out of players, but has also realized that they need to tone it down a little bit, which is, I think, why they're so successful at the moment. But, this is the stuff that's going on right now. And I do sense that maybe this Christmas break will be perfect. Everyone can just go away for a couple of weeks and let it cool down. But you do get the sense that this is something the club has to get a handle of very quickly.
Yeah, Adeyemi is such an interesting one. I think there's kind of two things happening here at once. As you said, there's these kind of really unfair personal attacks he's getting from the media, sections of the media who make a lot of money and get a lot of attention for making these kind of personal attacks on all sorts of German players. So that's not unfortunately surprising, even if it is unfair. And there's also the aspect of him as a player, and I think the two are obviously intertwined, but I think unfortunately one leads into the other in the sense that, if Adeyemi was scoring goals and creating chances and being the key man for Dortmund, I don't really think Bild reporters would be writing hit pieces about him. Now, that's not to say he deserves it because he's playing poorly, not anything like that, nothing like that at all. But it's the kind of duality of Adeyemi in the sense that he's a player who is immensely talented, got immense promise because of the attributes that he has, but has always, in my opinion, struggled for consistency. And I think the problem that he has always had at Dortmund is that he's never been able to nail down that consistency. Now, Niko Kovac is his third coach at Dortmund, and first he had Terzic, then Nuri Sahin, and now Niko Kovac. And all three of those head coaches are very, very different men. They have very different methods, and they've all played Adeyemi in very different roles. And the guy's only 23 years old. He's gone through a lot at Dortmund despite being such a young man. And I think how I kind of look at Adeyemi is that, and we were actually chatting about this in the group chat during the Dortmund game as I was watching it, and I think he's obviously got a huge bit of talent, but I also think he's one of those players that really has to work off instinct. I remember writing a piece back when he was working under, I think, Terzic at his time at Dortmund. He was in and out of the team. He was, there was a whole lot of talk about him playing for the under-21s for Germany to kind of get game time. Kovac was playing him as a wing back, if at all. And there's a lot of discussion as to what his role should be. And I remember I looked back at his time before Dortmund and looked at the stats, and the numbers tell you that he is better in the box as a penalty box striker when he's reacting in real time to, plays, exploiting space, reacting to the ball to feet, things like that. He's a penalty box striker. He's a poacher. But because he's so fast, because he's good at dribbling with the ball, every single head coach instinctively thinks, wow, this guy would be a great winger. This guy would be a great inside forward. This guy would be a great second striker. And what you end up getting is Adeyemi running around the pitch, doing what he can, but very rarely actually being inside the box. And as a result, I think that's largely one of the reasons why I think maybe he does struggle for form. He doesn't really get to play in his key position, in my opinion. He doesn't get to be the penalty box striker that I think he was before he joined Dortmund. And he certainly does a job for Dortmund. He has, he's had perfectly good games as wingers and as an inside forward and things like that. But I don't think he gets the best out of him. I think that's why we do see him have these very inconsistent runs. Even like this season alone, he had that run where he had like 1 assist and 2 goals in the start of the season, like in 3 games. And then a few weeks ago, he had goals back to back and then a couple in the Champions League. And it feels like every time he's like just kind of settling into a groove, things kind of come undone for him. And I think that is because he's a player who's having to kind of really fit into that Dortmund team where he's needed, really, unfortunately. If it was up to me, if I was the Dortmund head coach, I'd probably be try to play him up front. The fact that, okay, Guirassy's looked better in the last kind of couple of weeks, perhaps, but when Guirassy was going through a really rough form, I would have just stuck Adeyemi up front, said, sit in the box, cause havoc, play off the last man, and see how you do, because that's where I think his best position is. But I don't know, Manu. We'll need to kind of see where this takes him because, as you mentioned there, he will be entering his final year of his contract in 2026, in the summer of 2026, not the end of the season. And if he's not really prepared to sign a new contract with Dortmund, they'll have to maybe decide what they want to do. And honestly, if I were Dortmund, I probably would sell him. I'd sell him for the right price. And just kind of cut my losses and kind of go on with him. He reminds me of so much of Daniel Malen, who's also another extremely talented player, but perhaps a little too talented in the sense that he ends up being a kind of jack of all trades but master of none. At least he did at Dortmund. And I think Adeyemi's kind of fallen into the same kind of bracket, unfortunately. And, that means he's not consistent. That means he gets criticism, and unfortunately it means he gets these hit pieces from the German media.
Yeah, that's part of it. I think, I think what is at play here too, it is not just him. We had this chat a little bit about him getting these hit pieces by the German media, and that white players not necessarily would get it the same way. And that there is truth to this. I'm not going to deny that. But I think what's really fascinating about him is Loredana, his wife, is a very successful person, maybe even as successful, more successful than he is. And there's a little bit of a narrative here too. He's been represented by Gesti Food, and it's a very powerful Jorge Mendes' agency, and she plays a big role in that part of his life. And the German media has a very big problem with people, with powerful women. I remember, going back a little bit, Bianca Ilgner, who was Bodo Ilgner's agent and wife, was often a hit target until the family moved to Real Madrid. Angela Hessler, Ike Hessler's wife, is another one. More recent example is Wanda, right, with Mauro Icardi. That's the kind of like this power couple kind of families that this reminds me of. But with that in mind, with her having such a big say in his career and being so successful herself, and of course now the media going after him, and on top of that, I just looked at the Transfermarkt and looking at the clubs that are linked to him, throw in the agency, there's Barcelona's in there, Arsenal, Man United. If there is a strong market, I think Napoli were the club that were really interested in him in the summer. I'm pretty sure, when they make a decision together, and it sounds like the two of them make a lot of the decisions together with Jorge Mendes, was extremely successful, moving players to the clubs that suit them best. I think Dortmund will look at these hit pieces by the media and say, well, thank you. This is not necessarily what we wanted. And I think you raise another really important point. Maybe he needs to go to a club where they actually use him in his right position, because right now there's so much. They're trying so hard to getting Guirassy back going. And we've been talking about how they need a new center forward. They have a perfectly good center forward, maybe, and maybe it's Adeyemi, and he just needs to be used better.
Yeah, exactly. He does kind of unfortunately strike me as a kind of player who maybe does have to move on, maybe move to the Premier League, play for like a West Ham or something like that. And I mean, you could also make a pretty strong argument that so much of his game is built around running into space, and Dortmund obviously don't play a lot of games when they have a lot of space, so maybe he would actually be suited playing for a team in a league where he does more counter-attacking, and he just doesn't really have that at Dortmund to an extent. I don't know. It's a tricky one. It very much feels like a kind of square peg in a round hole here in terms of his spot in that Dortmund team. It's just more noise, man. It isn't. I was just thinking there in terms of like at the start of the season, we had the whole Felix Mecha stuff with the kind of what happened with him in social media, and then at the start of the season we had Joe Bellingham's dad kicking up a fuss in the changing rooms. I'm sure there's other ones that don't come to mind, but have completely slipped my mind. But there's obviously a huge bit of media interest around Dortmund. They have a lot of media presence, and maybe not to the same extent as Bayern, but when things aren't going well, people very quickly begin to pick up on that and start writing these kind of pieces trying to explain maybe what's going on behind closed doors. And it's all well and good for Dortmund to come out and show a brave face and say, everyone's fine here, we're a big happy family, but that doesn't really come across well when the player comes off the pitch and tries to storm down the storm when they're winning as well. That's the thing, they were winning at that point.
Yeah, and then the guy that came on scored the second goal.
But I think the Gladbach game is maybe a good example of maybe the problem they have with Adeyemi. Adeyemi was actually all over the place in that game. He was running around, he was chasing players down. He almost scored a goal when he kind of closed down the Gladbach defender so quickly. So maybe he would be thinking, I'm doing my role, I'm putting a shift in, but tactically speaking, he maybe isn't doing what Kovac needs him to do. And I think there's actually something interesting where he has that chance, I think it's in the first half, where Guirassy kind of lays it off to him. And if you do watch the highlight, after he hits the shot and misses it, Guirassy's in the middle of like tumbling over. He gets up, realises that Adeyemi didn't score the goal, and he screams at him. He absolutely screams at him. And I think that's actually quite an interesting little moment where it's like there's so much tension, there's so much pressure on these guys to kind of get back into form and score goals, that they are kind of letting loose out on each other on the pitch. And, when they come off it, they're not happy.